And with me as co-host is Dr. Anne Carlson, Senior Lecturer of French in the Department of World Languages and Cultures at Spelman College, Atlanta, Georgia. We welcome all our panelists who have graciously accepted our invitation to this roundtable, and to all our participants who have made time to join our discussion today, we bring welcome. This roundtable, Teaching African Literature Remotely in the Age of Pandemic, is sponsored by the African Literature Association Executive Council. Our focus on teaching remotely in these unusual times is very timely. In our time, the world is challenged by an unusual phenomenon that threatens to bring humankind on its knees. COVID-19 has struck at the heart of our professions, teaching. Obviously, everyone has a narrative about this pandemic and this insidious erosion on the way we work and live our lives. We are familiar with the daily news of its grip on nations, families, institutions, and educational institutions specifically. My memory goes back to a day in March 2020 when our university closed. Students had just come back to school right after Easter break. When the closure was announced, faculty was given a week to transition to online teaching. There were frantic efforts by the administration to transition both students and faculty to a new mode of teaching and learning. Many had never taught online, just as many students had never taken online courses. Both struggled hard to meet the demands of what was to become the new normal way of doing things. Now, as the year slips by, we, the faculty, yearn to go back to the classroom. Our students yearn to return to the classroom, preferring to learn in the physical classroom space to the solitude of remote learning. If my narrative is similar to yours, how have you managed this transition? Considering the expectations for instruction in our profession, what have you put in place? What innovations have you adopted or adapted to make learning possible and to engage your students in African literature and this related field? Our panelists are here to share the experiences of COVID-19 induced transition to online teaching. Areas of focus will include, but not limited to, resource availability, content and delivery challenges, assessment issues, best practices for student engagement, managing the digital divide, and these challenges in our institutions in the USA, Africa, and affiliate global institutions. Our panelists also come with diverse teaching backgrounds and experience in comparative literature, African film, performance arts, languages, to mention a few. We are glad to have a forum like this for sharing our findings and discoveries on this issue. And we hope to glean some valuable tips and strategies for teaching our courses during this spring 2021 semester. On this note, I would like to introduce our panelists. Here with us today to discuss the impact of COVID-19, Moradewun Adejumobi, Professor of African American and African Studies, Affiliate Faculty of Comparative Literature and French at the University of California, Davis. We have Chioma Opara, Professor of English and Comparative Literature, Humanities Department, Rivers State University, Port Harcourt, Nigeria. Mohammed Kamara, Associate Professor of French and Program Chair, Africana Studies at Washington and Lee University, Lexington, Virginia. We have Matthew Brown, Assistant Professor in the Department of African Cultural Studies, University of Wisconsin at Madison. Matt specializes in African screen media. He teaches courses on African screen media, oral traditions, African literature, and melodrama in Africa. Stephane Robolin is Associate Professor of English and former Director of the Center for African Studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, New Jersey. Specialization include African and African diasporic literatures, Black transnationalism, and post-colonial studies. Last but not least is Louisa Uchum Egbunike, Associate Professor of African Caribbean Literature in the Department of English Studies, Durham University, UK. As you can see, we have a well-rounded panel here. And the format of this roundtable will be like this. Each panelist has about 5 to 10 minutes presentation on the topic. Please feel free to use short slides if necessary. At the end, we shall take questions from our audience. And we encourage participants to please use this chat feature to send your questions or comments. We'll do our best to respond to most, if not all, questions today. And at the end of the presentation, I will be handing over to my co-host, Dr. Carlson. She will take charge. Now, going by the order on the flyer, may I ask Professor Adejumobi to begin her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline. I'd like to thank the members of the teaching committee of the African Literature Association for inviting me to participate in this conversation about the professional challenges that many of us are facing around, certainly around North America and around other parts of the world. Let me start by saying, just as Pauline had mentioned earlier, the transition to remote instruction for me was brutal. It was fast and furious and quick. And I remember that I had once watched something about Zoom, you know, several months before COVID started. And I thought, what a complicated platform. And I just abandoned it immediately. I didn't pay any attention to it. But when our university decided to move on to remote instruction and decided that Zoom was the platform that they were going to use, I had to make a very quick adjustment to this new system for teaching and for engaging with my students. I'd also like to say that in terms of the relevance of our conversation today for people who are teaching African literature around the world, a lot of this depends on what the local authorities where you are decide. In some instances, the local authorities have decided that there should be remote instruction. In some places, they've decided for hybrid instruction. Part of it is done online, part of it is done in person. In some places, they've decided to continue with actually teaching in a face-to-face format. And in some places, because they were worried about the pandemic, they have shut down the universities. So our conversation may not be uniformly relevant to everybody. It will be relevant to those teaching in universities where the authorities have said, this is what we are going to do. I'll just run through a few challenges that I have faced in carrying and conducting remote instruction. And these are not necessarily peculiar to the discipline of literary studies. They are challenges that anybody engaging in remote instruction as a teacher will confront. I think one of the biggest challenges is fostering actual discussion between the students, amongst themselves, and with the faculty, with the professor, with the instructor. That is a really big challenge. How do you foster actual conversation and discussion? When I used to do in-person teaching, I would give students points for participation. And this was part of the syllabus, that if you participated and you were present in class so many days of the week, so many days in the term, you would get a certain number of percentage points. I no longer do this because with online instruction and with technological challenges, with what our convener referred to as the digital divide, I can't insist that students be present in the class. I personally like to do what's called synchronous teaching. That is, I teach when the class is actually scheduled rather than recording it and then allowing students to watch the video recording later on. I do recordings, but I'll tell you how I use the recordings. I teach when the class is actually scheduled, but I can't insist that students be present. So what I've done is I've made it possible for students to earn additional credit by participating during the lecture. Every 15 to 20 minutes or so, I stop talking and I encourage students to put their responses, their comments, their questions in the chat. And usually when I stop talking after every 15 to 20 minutes, I ask students a leading question, a controversial question, and they have many different opinions about it. And so they're all writing furiously in the chat what they think. And I then take a break and I read through the questions and comments. Now, during my classes, some of my classes can be quite big. I ask all the students to shut off to mute themselves and to turn off their video. However, I read through the comments, and I find that once the term gets going, students become so accustomed to interacting through the chat that they begin having other kinds of conversations that are adjacent to the material we're discussing. You know, someone might say, did you watch this music video about whatever it was, and it seems related to this topic? And someone would say, I read something online the other day and it seems related to our topic. So they go beyond the actual teaching material to begin to converse with each other. And I find this to be healthy. I find this to be healthy to allow students to engage with each other in this way. Another challenge that I find for online, for remote instruction is assessments, examination, tests, quizzes. And I would say that how you handle this depends in part on the learning management system that your university operates. My university uses something called Canvas, which is widely used by many universities in North America. So that's what I use to organize assignments. Now, increasingly, I give students assignments that are take-home assignments because that's just what is easiest to monitor. Because again, you don't want to disadvantage students by saying you have a quiz you have to take, and then maybe their internet falls out at that particular point in time. I still do give quizzes, but when I give quizzes, I give quizzes where the quiz itself is available for 6 hours, 8 hours. Now, when you do that, how do you avoid cheating? How do you ensure that some students are not going to cheat? My main solution has been to randomize questions, so that if I have 5 questions in a quiz, I will have between 5 and 8 versions of each question. And the Canvas system itself automatically randomizes the question. So even if you're sitting with your friend and doing the quiz at the same time, there's a likelihood that you and your friend will not get the same question. I also shorten the amount of time students have to answer the actual quiz. The quiz is available for them with a period of up to 6 hours, so that depending on what their situation is, if their internet falls out, they can still do the quiz when their internet comes back on. But I find that assessments are a real challenge, and I look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say. The last thing I will say, there's much more to be said, but I don't want to take up all the time because I know that my colleagues also have a lot to share, is that technological issues are a real challenge. They're a challenge for the students. Not all students are in a place where they have reliable internet. Sometimes they have to phone in, they can't do the video. Not all students are in a place which is quiet where they can listen. And in order to cater for students who cannot always listen, who cannot always participate, I do actually make audio recordings of my lectures. Why don't I do video recordings? I want to give the students an incentive to actually log on. And as I said, I give them extra credit for responding to my own questions during the teaching and for asking what I consider to be perceptive questions. And what I do with Zoom is I save the chat. I save the chat, and at the end of the term, I go through all of the chat to see which students were responding to my questions, which students were asking what I consider to be really insightful questions, and then I assign extra credit for doing that. The students who take my classes are now aware of that. So they tend to be very enthusiastic participants in the actual conversations that we are having during the lecture. There are many other options and many other possibilities, but I think I'm going to stop for now. I probably used about 5 minutes, and hand over to the next person in line so that they can share their insights from remote instruction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Moradewun. Now, I don't see Professor Chioma Opara here, so I'll go straight to Mohammed.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Pauline, for putting this together and for inviting me to participate and share my experiences. Thanks to Matt Brown for doing the back-end work in regards to YouTube and everything else that he does so well. So remote teaching, and of course, I had never done it before in my life. I'd never given it much thought until our university was shut down on March 13th, like so many other schools. Fortunately for us, we had 2 weeks because the closing happened just around our midterm break. And so we had an additional week to get ready to come back to campus and as professors, because the students were asked to stay home and to teach remotely. I would just like to start by making some comments about some basics. What I realized very quickly, I am a dinosaur when it comes to technology. And so I always go for the basics, the most basic possible. And I realize it reduces stress on me because first of all, I didn't have enough time to learn all the gimmicks about remote teaching using Zoom and Canvas, which my university uses also. And I realized that, of course, the students were mostly well-versed in these matters than I am, and there was no way I was going to impress them by taking a 2-week lesson in these things. So I decided to just focus on the basics. And I decided early on to teach synchronously, which meant that the students and I would be on the same time, even if not at the same place, because I believe that that works better for me in teaching, especially teaching certain courses like literature and languages. So during the pandemic, I've had the opportunity to teach courses, not necessarily specifically on literature, African literature, but I've taught courses on Francophone cultures and civilizations, which is French 280 for us. This is open to students who have had at least 4 semesters of French at the college level. And this particular course on Francophone cultures and literatures focuses on West Africa, but the COVID thing allowed me to modify the course and to focus half of the course on West Africa and the other half on the French Caribbean, focusing specifically on Martinique and Haiti. And the goal was to show the students that as far removed as these places were from each other, that is Africa and the Caribbean, there are a lot of things that the Black people occupying these spaces have in common. And so the COVID allowed me to experiment with that particular course. Well, as a species, we don't operate very well remotely. This is not to say, of course, that we operate particularly well in close proximity. But generally speaking, with specific reference actually to African literature or African studies in general, under normal circumstances, when students are more mentally and emotionally present, it is not easy to keep their focus, especially when the course is an elective, like those courses that I taught, and the material is being taught in a foreign language, in French in my case, and to students with varying levels of competence in the language. And so it becomes particularly more difficult as Associate Professor Ann Sokolowski at Ohio Wesleyan noted that we lose a lot of things in the process. Certain cues, for example, that in-person teaching will allow us to benefit from. So for example, what are the facial expressions of the students? What is their body language? And where does the student sit in the classroom? And how do the students relate to each other? How do they look at each other when I am talking to them, for example, or when a student is presenting and how the other students are looking at that student and relating to what the student is saying. And so, but also the students react in other ways. They smile, they laugh, and they might yawn for all kinds of reasons, maybe because they are tired or maybe because what I'm saying is boring. When we teach remotely, we don't have the benefit of those things. And so when you're teaching, as Professor Adejumobi has mentioned, especially in regards to doing effective conversations and discussions, and those become particularly more pronounced when you're teaching about distant places, when you're teaching about so-called remote places, that is teaching in America, but teaching about Africa or the Caribbean, for example. And it makes it that much harder to get the students' interest. It makes it that much harder to focus on the relevance of what they teach. But also this poses a challenge and an opportunity for us to come up with inventive ways of doing our teaching, even though we may never effectively do so in a way that we do when we are in an in-person setting. And you know, when you're teaching remotely via Zoom, for example, the best you can see is the heads of the students. Sometimes you see their entire rooms or wherever space they are occupying. And this could be distractions in so many ways, because if they are in a space where they don't have enough room to themselves, and you might be teaching them and somebody is passing, crossing the screen behind them, or somebody's talking to them, somebody walks into the kitchen, if the kitchen is the only space the student has to use as a classroom. So we have to deal with these challenges and to make the class interesting, of course, and relevant as well. And the other point I wanted to touch on is the question of resource availability. You know, it is fortunate for us who are teaching in the West. We have a lot of resources, as opposed to our colleagues, for example, who are teaching on the ground in Africa and who may not have access to the same resources that we have. That said, we are also faced with certain challenges. For example, when we had to make the switch from in-person to Zoom teaching at the start of COVID, I had included certain themes to teach in my class on African civilization and culture. And in the other class, which is Africa and its avatars, which focuses on the representation of Africa by non-Africans and the representation of Africans by themselves. And I included themes like La Pirogue, which is the movie by Moussa Traoré, but also La Noire 2, The Black Off by Sembène Ousmane. And it took me ages to locate that theme because it was available, digitally available to our students when they were on campus. But the moment we switched to remote learning, because of copyright issues, that theme was no longer available to students. So I had to use a colleague who was the director of our language laboratory, where we digitize our movies and allow the students to watch. And he spent hours just to locate a video version of La Noire 2 by Sembène Ousmane. And so it took a lot of time and resources to do that, to allow my students to watch that particular movie, because I didn't want to replace it with another movie. But also movies like La Pirogue, for example, or Atlantic, the latest film from Job, created a problem because it was available on Canopy, but then it was removed again. And this shows, of course, the paucity of availability of resources on Africa on the internet. And so changes have to be made to the syllabus to allow the class to move on. But also teaching in person allows me to bring certain artifacts into class. You can, of course, show the students things, artifacts, but they cannot touch them. They can only see them in one dimension, not in 3 dimensions. So when I'm teaching, for example, Sunjata, the Epic of Old Mali, I will bring in kola nuts and allow the students to touch the kola nuts and to eat the kola nuts. But I also bring in cowrie shells so they can see some of these things that are mentioned in the book. But the best you can do is to show the students from afar, and the experience is not the same. And so these are challenges, of course, that we have to deal with, and many more. But I will stop here for now because I have my colleagues who are waiting in the wings to say their bit, and we'll have opportunity during question and answer to say some other things as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mohammed. Next on the list is Matthew.
Hello, everyone. I too want to thank Pauline and the rest of the ALA EC for inviting me here to speak today. I, in some ways, don't have a lot to add. I'd like to echo what the previous panelists have been discussing. One way I might frame it is that as I've been thinking about even preparing my new syllabus for this semester, and I happen to be teaching a course that's going to focus on theoretical questions around structure and agency. I actually think that's also a great way of framing what we're trying to do in the classroom these days. I want to err, it seems, always on the side of allowing my students as much flexibility as possible. I'm greatly sympathetic to all the different kinds of situations that they might be finding themselves in. I have a very difficult home situation myself. I'm sometimes trying to teach while I'm also, homeschooling small kids and helping them out with their schooling. So I perfectly understand when my students have difficulty joining a session, when they have difficulty meeting certain deadlines. But I've also been hearing from students a lot lately that they need structure. They need some help sort of like keeping up with things. And one of the issues here, I think, is to be kind of brutally honest with ourselves, at least in my case, the vast majority of my students, are not majoring in the content that I'm teaching, especially undergraduate students. They're not taking my classes necessarily because it's a very key part of their studies, but in some cases because it's a requirement for a sort of liberal arts breadth. Sometimes it's because it's a class that emphasizes writing and they need to take a course like that. So it's important to their studies. Obviously, we know that our work is incredibly important to their studies and that without it, they would have an inadequate education. But it's not highest on their list of priorities. And that's just, again, a brutal fact that we have to face. And so when we're in a situation where we might be low on their list of priorities and things are very difficult to manage, what we're doing in our classes could sort of fall by the wayside. And so once again, I'm hearing from students that it's actually helpful to provide some kind of real structure to keep them engaged, to keep them going, to make sure that they don't just let the things that we're asking them to do fall to the wayside. So like Moradewun, I try to strike this balance between having synchronous sessions where I teach live on Zoom, where I lecture, where I ask questions, where we have some discussions. But then I also create, asynchronous activities, things that they can do on their own time, when they can make time for it themselves. So if a normal course at UW-Madison has 2 or perhaps 3 meetings per week, lately, I'm having just one of those courses or one of those class meetings be synchronous, and then sort of turning the other course time into asynchronous activities. When it comes to whether or not we should require attendance during those synchronous events, I too feel like it's really difficult to require students to do something that they may, just be physically unable to do, that technologically or materially unable to join us at certain times. So in some cases, I will also record those things. But I find that making it a requirement, but allowing a sort of large amount of flexibility with absences, letting them have 5 or more sort of free absences that have no effect on grade, sort of mimics, again, what Moradewun was talking about in terms of giving them an incentive to actually be there, but knowing that it's not always possible. Again, students are saying to me, I needed that. I needed to know it was a requirement. I needed to know it had some kind of effect on my grade to keep me on track and to make me show up. And then I was also really grateful for these other things that I could kind of, structure around the other things that I have in my daily life. So the sort of big takeaway that I'm still grappling with, and like I said, I have my own kind of personal challenges teaching at home these days, and I understand that students do. And I don't think that I am by any means a real paragon of online teaching. I'm struggling the way most of us are. I'm finding that this is one of the very key details, is to spend a lot of time up front at the beginning of the semester, really thinking through the ways that I can ensure that my students have certain benchmarks and certain requirements that are going to keep them on task, and then also know that a great amount of flexibility built in there is going to allow them to succeed. And that seems to be working, that seems to be resonating with students. It seems to be allowing for us to get through as much as possible. And then one other minor thing I wanted to just mention is that this past semester I had a couple of students write to me and say that they were diagnosed with COVID-19 and that it might have an effect on their ability to engage. And in the end of the day, they were all fine. And they all recovered and everything worked out. So we were all very grateful for that. But it just seemed logical to me to, after maybe a week had passed, to check in on those students, I mean, they may still have been attending and so on, but just to check in and make sure everything was going well, that they had enough energy, etc., to keep going. And they all replied that I was the only instructor who had done that, and that they were surprised and grateful for sort of that check-in. And that really kind of dumbfounded me that that's not a more common practice. So it's really doesn't take a lot of time, and I think it's a really helpful thing is just checking in, and it doesn't even have to be those that are diagnosed with anything, just checking in to make sure that people are sort of weathering this storm that we're all weathering seems to have gone a really long way. And again, I was kind of surprised by it, but it really sort of renewed my faith in the sort of collaborative effort that teaching is, and the collaborative way that we have to do it these days. So I too will leave it there and turn it over to the rest of the panelists, my next colleague, to take over, and I'll be happy to field questions later if they come up.
Thank you, Matt. Next is Stephane.
Hello. Let me begin by adding my thanks to the Research and Teaching Committee of the ALA for holding this roundtable, for inviting me to participate, and many thanks to Pauline and to Anne for hosting, as well as to my fellow colleagues here for their thoughtful reflections. Allow me to open with a confession that I'm among those who fervently hope that we're not obligated to teach remotely for much longer. It was, as my co-panelists have already noted, a brutal and for me very humbling transition to remote instruction. But I hope that some of these practices born of desperate necessity might be extended into our pedagogy as well in a less desperate future. My remarks today are not presented as experiences, but are very much born of experiences over the last 2 semesters. And I really have 3 points for consideration. The first point is about content and format, although it's perhaps also a plea. So as literary and cultural scholars, our own labor is profoundly dependent upon the labor of African artists. Under normal times, those artists are able to circulate, to visit, and otherwise share their work and ideas. But the pandemic's severe strictures on circulation and in-person gathering has significantly diminished the livelihoods of African cultural producers, especially those unattached to academic or other kinds of institutions. And for those working with expensive materials, really compromised even their ability to make art. Now, many of us have seen our research or speaker funds slashed as universities tighten their belts, and there are very real limitations here to consider. But for those who have even small amounts of funds to support African artists who depend upon their art, I want to urge us to lend that support. This can mean, among other things, inviting them into our virtual classrooms or orchestrating events departmentally, even if online, in which they are featured. Insofar as this panel is focused on teaching, if technology allows, this is a prime moment to place students in conversations with African writers, musicians, and visual artists. I've seen my students wake up in dramatic ways during and after encounters with living authors. And this past semester, I had the pleasure of hosting Makosazana Kaba, who shared with my students her thinking about her short stories and poems. So yes, artists are frequently resourceful, and yes, arranging for remote class visits can have their challenges for sure. But turning our available resources towards artists upon whom we rely, especially those without alternative incomes, seems vital in this precarious moment. The second point I want to make involves highlighting existing texts that can give us entry points into this moment. For some time now, African texts have meditated upon epidemics and pandemics that have hit the African continent. These texts can certainly give us perspective on our current moment and vice versa. That is, our current moment can help us rethink or better understand features of prior epidemics. I'm not suggesting an equivalence of outbreaks that have hit Africa. They're very significant differences, but we do have a chance here to compare and contrast across epidemiological moments. Let me point as an example to Phaswane Mpe's Welcome to Our Hillbrow, the American edition of which features an introduction by our current ALA president, Girmay Negash. The 2001 novel charts multiple characters' negotiations of, among other things, the AIDS virus that exploded in South Africa after the formal fall of apartheid. Formally and linguistically, it deconstructs the stigmatizing language of judgment towards AIDS patients, but it likewise deconstructs the rampant xenophobic language as well as the noxious linkage between communicable disease and migrants as dangerous carriers that xenophobia too readily fosters. In the Francophone world, Véronique Tadjo's recent novel, En Compagnie des Hommes, translated in English and soon to be released as In the Company of Men, traces the reflections of witnesses or survivors of the Ebola virus that began plaguing West Africa in 2014. The book opens with a daughter exiled from her village by her dying, contaminated family in order to save her, banished to the city where she ultimately also falls ill. It's a wide-ranging text exploring the complex social and natural ecologies underlying the outbreak, and one that charts the cultural or psychological ruptures and the piecemeal remakings in its wake. These kinds of texts can generatively be worked into syllabi as launching points for interrogating the meaning of this moment. Bringing these two texts together, we are moved to consider the differences between a rapid acting contagion transmitted through bodily fluids and a slowly manifesting sexually transmitted virus in a conservative rural area. And yet the social dynamics both take up, throw into relief a range of concepts and questions. Now, one such concept ripe for exploration with our students leads to my third and my final point, that of social distancing. Over the last 10 months, social distancing has been offered as a life-saving epidemiological tool. But social distancing also names deeply rooted forms of distinction, stratification, and segregation that long preceded the COVID pandemic. While the current conception of social distancing focuses on sustaining life The more historical structural forms of social distancing draw our eyes to marginalization and necropolitics. But as one form of social distancing is overlaid upon the other, contradictions come sharply into view. How this plays out on the African continent is quite evident in Mpe's and Tadjo's text, which highlight the social phenomena of epidemiological crises. But numerous essays have also explicated the material impracticality or costs of social distancing. In their article, Face Me, I Face You, Dele-Adedeji and Ella Jeffries remind us how Lagos town planning and architectural design in the colonial era created a legacy of spatial compression in the working class areas of the port city that make keeping one's distance a physical impossibility. And that's a text I've been able to incorporate into my classes. Lagosian OluTimehin Adegbeye similarly poses the question, what if you can't afford social distancing? And while economics is fundamental, the physical constraints of COVID intensifies other pre-existing social hierarchies. Senegalese Loez Udenhusen reminds us that queer citizens confined to live with homophobic family members in this period are forcibly subject to their heteronormative coercion. These pieces underscore only a few of the ways that the material and psychological consequences of older forms of social distancing get compounded under pandemic conditions. At the end of Tadjo's text, we encounter the Ebola virus, who gets to speak and pronounces the following lines. It isn't me that men should fear. They should fear themselves. The virus has a point that students could find well worth considering here. I'll conclude my comments here and look forward to the discussion. I will also try to provide links to the text that I have referenced here for easier access. I hope to place them in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephane, for that enlightening discussion. Can we go now to Louisa, and after her we go to Professor Opara, who is, I can see she's there right now, here with us. Okay, Louisa, up to you.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you again to the Research and Teaching Committee of ALA for the invitation, and thank you to Pauline and Anne for their organising of this session. I think, unlike my colleagues, I'm based in the UK, so in many ways what's already been said is relevant, but there are some differences to how we teach in the UK. And one of those differences is that a lot of the decisions that have been taken around how to approach teaching remotely have been taken centrally. So there is some flexibility, or there is the opportunity to kind of have an input in that conversation, but we don't have as much, at least in my experience, don't have as much freedom and flexibility as possibly colleagues in the US. My situation also is different in that I moved institutions in the midst of all this. So I was working at City University of London when the first lockdown in the UK began in March last year. And then I moved to Durham University in September. So I'm in a strange situation where I had my interview online. I haven't met my colleagues face-to-face. I haven't met my students face-to-face. I haven't yet set foot in Durham University. And so that provides its own set of challenges when you're teaching remotely and you don't know the students, you don't have a rapport with the students, you don't know your colleagues very well, and everything is taking place online. So that in itself, and also just trying to get to grips with different ways of doing things and you know, the resources that are available at my new institution. So that's been a particular challenge, and I'll speak a little bit more about that. But I just wanted to start with a reflection on 2020. And like whenever there is a challenge, I turn to Things Fall Apart for some clarity, and I sort of return to this text because I think it offers such great insight. And it just reminds me that the disruption that we're speaking about, the turmoil that we're in, the challenges that we face, just reminds me of what Adejumobi describes as the year the year that the world went mad, when the rains came late, when the sun was blazing, and all the seed yams that Okonkwo had obtained from Nwakibie just roasted or rotted in the ground, and everything was thrown upside down. And so that, to me, is a kind of apt way of thinking through 2020 in the context of African literature. So I'm at an institution that, prior to COVID, didn't really have much of a tradition or of a culture of really kind of embracing digital resources in a way that I've seen in other institutions that I've worked in. And so I think it's been a very steep learning curve for many of my colleagues. And part of what this has meant also is, in terms of digital resources, at the moment the library is quite challenged in working to digitize chapters where possible, to obtain ebooks where possible. And also my institution doesn't have a history of teaching African literature. And so whilst I have colleagues who do introduce African novels and African texts on modules like an introduction to the novel, there hasn't really been a basis. So that means that the library, whilst it's very well stocked, at times lacks in the area of African literature. And so this has been one of the challenges that I've faced. And then when trying to request works, there's a backlog now. So if I'm requesting a book, the library is so overwhelmed with all these requests, it might take a while to come into stock. And what I've noticed is there's a number of texts that I would love to include, whether it's literature, whether it's plays, or whether it's critical materials. And many of these aren't actually available in ebook format. So for example, Teaching the Dilemma of a Ghost, I couldn't find an ebook version of it. And then some of the publishers of African literature, some of the really important but smaller publishers of African literature and African literary criticism, don't really seem to have ebook versions. And when there are ebook versions, at times there are issues with institutional licenses. So I might find an ebook version, but then find out that actually the library isn't able to acquire it. So this has been particularly challenging, especially as the situation in the UK has changed. So prior to the Christmas break, there was a hybrid approach taken, at least for the degree program that I teach on. Most people were teaching remotely, but there were some face-to-face sessions taking place, and students were able to access the library should they wish to. Since Christmas, students have been told to stay wherever they are. And so there's a situation now where many students have their books left in their dorms, or have already bought books, or were relying on library resources and don't have access to them. So this challenge of resources has become even more sort of profound in the wake of the increasingly worsened situation in the UK, and the kind of inability for students to be able to access these materials. My approach to teaching in terms of lectures has been to pre-record lectures and upload them. Some of my colleagues teach synchronously. So when we pre-record, those that pre-record, what we've been encouraged to do is to pre-record the lectures and then upload them around the time the lecture is due, so that there is still that structure in place for students, so that they can still log on at the usual time they would have the lecture and engage. And we've also been encouraged, and I've been doing this as well, to, rather than recording an hour-long lecture, which I would deliver normally in person, if you are pre-recording, to try and break it down into slots. We're increasingly aware of screen fatigue. We're spending far more time in front of computers than we normally do. And it is tiring, and it's a different kind of interaction. And so by trying to approach lectures in a way that you break it down into 3 chunks, students can dip in and out as they wish to. And this hopefully makes the experience a bit more manageable for them. But we've all of my colleagues in my department, we have to provide either video, pre-recorded video, or synchronous video, and then that synchronous video is also recorded and placed online. And this is quite a big departure for my department, who had resisted providing video recordings of lectures. This had been apparently an ongoing debate that had taken place, and students had been requesting this, and my department had been resisting this. And so this is a complete culture shift, and I'd be interested to see in the wake of all this, where that leaves us, what our teaching looks like. One of the important things for me in all this, in terms of relating to students, is really just to have empathy. We're all faced with very unusual conditions we're working in, and the experience of students aren't uniform. So I have some of my students have decided to spend the year in their home countries, wherever that may be. So we've got students who might be working in different time zones, with differing availability of internet or differing qualities of internet. Some students who are using the data to access, and so that sets up its own sets of challenges. Students with anxiety, being socially distanced or possibly being isolated at times. So issues around anxiety have sort of really come to the fore. And then students with health issues and concerns around COVID. So students really, and staff, as well, colleagues as well, are really dealing with quite a lot. So I've been trying to be as empathetic as possible, checking in, as Matthew said, checking in with students, particularly those who have reached out to me and expressed that they are finding this difficult, making sure students are able to access the necessary support systems and know what's available to them. Those have been part of the important pastoral elements to being an instructor during this period. What I have found difficult, and I mentioned this before, just not knowing my students, is in the classroom setting when we do have a tutorial. It's not easy to pick up on nonverbal cues when you've got a screen full of faces. Those who would have been shy about speaking anyway might even be more shy in this context. Students who aren't able to have their videos on or muted for whatever reason, how to involve them in the chat, and that's been a challenge, trying to make sure that their voice is heard through using chat functions, but then trying to make sure there's still a flow to the whole session. Those have been some of the challenges. I think though there is something to take away from this experience. There are students who, with learning differences, who actually have benefited from having more e-resources online, and students as well who don't have learning differences, but having e-resources online, having more online resources, the accessibility. Of course, this places extra pressure on staff, and it does take more time to produce content. So as I pre-record my lectures, I find this, you sort of slip up somewhere, and normally in a lecture you just keep going, but the tendency for me is to pause, to go back, to re-record. So the process of recording a lecture takes longer than the hour allotted. Then I have to convert it into the right format, which takes an eternity, and then uploading online takes even longer. So what normally would be an hour delivery can take me, the best part of half of a day to record, convert, and upload. And so those kinds of added pressures are challenging and aren't necessarily taken into consideration always in terms of how things are workloaded. Yeah, I think I didn't actually check when I started talking, so I don't know how many minutes I've been speaking for. But I think also one of the things about going last is that you find a lot of the things that you're thinking have already been said. So I'll just say one final thing about trying to kind of create a welcoming classroom environment online. It is a challenge. It has been difficult. One of the things that I've been trying to do as well is that whether I'm supervising a dissertation or whether I'm having a tutorial session or whether I'm meeting a student during my office hours, is just before launching into discussing texts, just to say, how are things going for you? How are you managing? How are you finding things? How are you finding the online teaching? Is it resonating for you? What's going on with you? How are you doing generally? Just a little check-in. And I think students do appreciate it, so that you do show the human side of you, that it's obviously you're there to teach, but you also take an interest just generally in how they're responding to the material in this format, but also just generally how they're doing. Regularly getting emails about students who have been exposed to COVID, who are isolating. So it's also to sort of factor that in, that students are dealing with different issues in their own personal lives, and we're meeting them in the classroom. We're not always aware of everything that's going on. So just to show that empathy, that concern, but also where possible, be as flexible as possible to be able to accommodate and to show them that, you know, that you do care. So that I think I'll end there.
Okay. Thank you, Louisa, for your bringing that international perspective to this audience. We have Professor Chioma Opara with us here, and we're going to give her opportunity to, you know, bring her presentation to us. Professor Opara, are you there? Hello? Okay. I think we lost her. Hello?
No,
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. Okay. Go ahead.
Can you see me?
I can't see you yet.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm having problems. I had problems joining you. Can you see me now? Can you? Hello?
Yes, we can see you now.
You can see me, and you can hear me also?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm so sorry I joined you late. This is just to tell you what we go through in Africa, trying to teach online. I could not join early because it was difficult. We normally have a lot of glitches when we want to join any teaching online. It's so difficult, very difficult. And it gave me it gave me an idea of what my students were experiencing or have been experiencing. I teach modern African literature to postgraduate students. And most often, the class may be half of what it's supposed to be. What do I mean by that? If it's supposed to be a class of 6 students, for instance, you may end up teaching only 3 students. Why? Because the other 3 could not attend or cannot attend. The problem we have here is a problem of connection. We are not as privileged as the developed world when it comes to connections. We have problems of what we call network. When the network is down, it is not possible for you to teach. And when you teach, you may be able to teach only very few of the students because the other students may not be able to reach you. And that was what happened to me this evening when I was trying to connect. It was so difficult. It took me about 15 minutes or more. In fact, it took me about 20 minutes to connect. And this is the problem. The other problem we have here in Africa is that of funding, finances. I understand that in America, my colleagues down there tell me that they are giving laptops. They are giving students, both students and lecturers are giving laptops. It doesn't happen that way here. We do not have those facilities. So most students do not have the facilities to even take the classes. They do not have laptops. Even those who have telephones may not even have smartphones. So the problem there is that of what I may call a problem of deprivation. So when we started teaching online, in fact, that was a unique experience for us, because prior to the COVID, most people did not know what it meant to teach online. It was not part of our curriculum to teach online. But when the COVID started and there was lockdown in most, well, everywhere there was lockdown, we were constrained to start teaching by Zoom. I must say that my university is one of the few universities that ever embarked on teaching online or teaching by Zoom. Some other universities could not do it. So some other universities found it difficult to cope with it, but I'm happy we had the experience. We all had to train for it. The students also had to go and learn how to take classes online. But then there were also other difficulties. What are the difficulties? The difficulties of having enough, because the university does not fund the teaching or the learning. So students are forced to look for means to get what we call data, to get the data to join the classes, because we don't have free Wi-Fi. So it was, it has been a very excruciating experience for most students and even for lecturers. There are lecturers who prior to the COVID did not even have reliable laptops. So everybody was forced to learn how to teach using these facilities. So because the Zoom classes will only allow you 30 minutes, when you ask students to join after the first 30 minutes or 45 minutes, they tell you they do not have the means to join. So you cannot, I hope you all appreciate what we've been going through. They tell you they don't have the means, and you don't blame them. They do not have the means. There is that empathy on the part of lecturers. I personally had so much empathy for the students because there is no free Wi-Fi. After 30 minutes, the class is ended. When you say, let us try another 30 minutes to give it, to have at least 1 hour of teaching, they tell you they do not have the means. So it is a problem. It is frustrating, very frustrating for us down here. Very, very frustrating. So what some lecturers will do, especially as the classes are not so many, some lecturers started teaching face-to-face in order to help the students. I must point out here that we have a problem too in my university and in some other universities as well. Literature, we normally have at the stage of postgraduate students, that is graduate studies, you find out that most students would rather go for language than for literature. Why? They tell you they don't want to read. It's easier to do a master's in language, English language, than a master's in English literature. They tell you that when they have to do that, the master's in English literature, where they are going to study a lot, by the time you read African literature, read European literature and all that, American literature, you are already reading so much. So students our students would rather go for courses in language than in literature. So this is the problem we have as teachers in literature. When you have a class of maybe 20 postgraduate students in English, you find out that 16 or maybe 15 are in the language option, while 5 or 4 will be in the literature option because they do not want to read. And when you come to reading, there is a lot of frustration because the books are not available. The books are not available. I just traveled to the US. I had to get Ngugi's Perfect 9, which is his latest. What am I going to do with my students? I'm going to take this book. Luckily, it's not very big. It's slim. I'm going to photocopy Perfect 9 and give to my students. And luckily, there are not many. There are just about three in my class because the majority of them are in the language option. So these are the experiences. When we want to teach any book, if the book is not available in the market and you are not able to get the book to photocopy for the students, it is a problem. They end up going online, reading commentaries or reading comments on the book. And when they read those comments, they end up not reading the main book, the text. These are the problems, these are the challenges we have, a whole lot of challenges. And for me, as a veteran teacher, what I do is to try to photocopy as many materials as I can for my students. And because there is this, I don't know, the reading culture is going down, you find out that even when you have photocopied, most of them will not read. We have a problem. The reading culture is a big problem for us here. Don't know whether it's like that in other parts of the world, but it is a problem for us. So teaching literature in Africa is a huge challenge, and it has been made more complex by the pandemic. But the good, apart from the downside, the good aspect, or the good aspect in all these is that students are now getting with the lockdown and with the harrowing experiences people are going through, especially when it comes to finances, because a lot of people do not have their jobs, and because their parents do not have don't have jobs, they find it difficult to go to school. And when they come to school, they find it difficult to even provide for themselves. So the pandemic is now linked to what I would call destitution. It's now linked to angst. A lot of students are very angry, very, very angry. And because most students do not know or do not go through what is going on in the developed world. For instance, the number of people dying in America, you cannot compare the number to Africa, because in Africa, a lot of people, well, students, so far, we haven't had any problems. And even among us as lecturers, I don't know whether it's the heat, but somehow a lot of people have been able to survive the pandemic. So when you talk about social distancing, they are a bit skeptical. Because in Africa, people hug. People are ready to hug. They do not understand what it means not to hug. So you see students coming in, holding one another. You talk about sanitizer, they're not even taking it seriously. I must tell you, maybe you may be shocked. Most of our students do not take it seriously. They don't take the pandemic. In fact, most people in Africa do not take it seriously. They believe it's a scam. And I don't know why. They think it's a scam. So when you tell students about social distancing, it sounds Greek. But all the same, I believe that at the end of it all, we are going to get some good sides coming out, or some, at least the good aspects of this pandemic is that we have learned how to teach online. We have also learned how to manage our students, even when we do not see them. And we have also, but I must tell you that today, because the lockdown was eased off, we now can teach face-to-face in our institution. We can teach face-to-face, but we obey all the protocol, the COVID protocol, but we still teach online when the need arises.
Okay.
Thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm glad that we have heard the experiences of our panelists. Permit me now to have the co-host, Anne, please take charge at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a couple of questions in the chat for Professor Opara to begin. The first question is, Professor Opara, from your experience, would you say that there have been positive results from online teaching? What are these results, and what other suggestions do you have for your colleagues? I think you're on mute, Professor Opara.
Sorry. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Okay. I must say that there is some positive result. And the positive result is, the main result, I just said one result of it, is that we can now teach online. Before then, we didn't know how to teach online. We were not teaching online. So we can now teach online. And the students have also learned how to study, online, and how to learn online. What is my suggestion? My suggestion is that the government, the Nigerian government, should allocate more funds to universities so that when situations like this arise, we will not be left in the lurch, because we were left in the lurch. We will not be left in the lurch. Students will be able to cope, and lecturers will also be able to cope. So if we had funding, there will be Wi-Fi in the university, and there will not be problems for students to join classes. Some cannot join the classes because they do not have the means to join those classes. So my suggestion is that something has to be done to enable students to face with such problems, and also lecturers, because there are some lecturers who also have the same challenges that students have.
Okay, thank you, Professor Opara. There's a second question for you. A participant notes that it's interesting and to listen to your experiences, and they're wondering how copyright works, especially in relationship to African authors whose books have to be photocopied in order to be taught.
I think, yeah, that's the problem. We are breaking the laws, are we not? But, well, we do that here. I'm sorry to say, because that's the only way. That's the only way out. That's the only way out. That's the only way out. Because without that, the students will not gain access to the books. So I would also ask you to suggest to us what else we can do, because this is an interactive session. If you think there are other things we can do apart from photocopying to read, what do you suggest? Please tell us, because this is a problem for us. It's a big problem.
Okay, thank you. Are there any of our... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I said you haven't. I wanted people to suggest, because this is a problem for us, because if we don't photocopy, then the students will not have access to the book. So what,
yes.
Even my own books, we all photocopy, I don't know. Do you have a suggestion?
I'm watching the chat, and I will let you know if there are any suggestions. Right now, there's a comment. They're asking if you could speak to student writing production and the pandemic impact on critical writing or critical analysis production.
If I can do what?
Speak to student writing production and the pandemic impact on critical writing or critical analysis from students.
Yes, it does. Because the literary production has been slowed down tremendously, because the atmosphere is not so conducive. And even the analysis, as I said, has been thwarted because sometimes the originality is not there. They have to take what others have said. Because, due to the fact that, I just mentioned it because of, due to the fact that they are not reading enough, the analysis is also undermined. This is my own take.
Okay, thank you. Are there any of our panelists? Okay, so Mohammed has a question for Stephane. Please go ahead, Mohammed.
Hello. Yes, Stephane, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the points that you made about using African text as a way of getting into discussions about pandemic, especially about what is going on right now, to bring past African experiences and making those connections with the present. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that and how that might relate to the question of empathy, for example, that Louisa raised in our own conversations, how teaching such text will allow our students on the other side of the Atlantic to relate to the African experience empathically speaking. Thank you in advance for your answer.
Thank you, Mohammed, for your question. I think, insofar as we read literature to open up or expose students to literature in order to open up their experience to questions that have not occurred to them as a result of experiences that they've not had. This is a moment, I think, for empathy facilitated by literature, not just because the literature provides an opening for them, but also because they may themselves be open as a result of their own sort of frailties and susceptibilities and social pressures, may themselves be open to rethinking the assumptions that they themselves have been having about, a country or a group of people far away from them. I think it's a prime moment for reflecting on similarities. I also think that this is a moment to remind them that similarities doesn't mean that there aren't significant disparities between their experiences and others. Certainly there are disparities within the same classroom that we have, but I also think that we can remind our own students about sometimes the facade of solidarity that can sometimes surface in assuming that my experiences are just like yours, but also to understand that there are connecting points for perhaps more substantial and substantive empathies and solidarities as well. I hope that helps, Mohammed.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Moradewun has some comments in response to what other panelists have said.
Thank you very much, Anne. I just wanted to follow up on some things that my fellow panelists have said. At least two panelists have brought up questions of copyright. One, copyright about films, and the other, copyright about print literature. And I would say some of these copyright issues precede the current moment, but they have certainly been exacerbated by the current moment. And the current moment has exacerbated these problems with copyright. And I think they show the underbelly, the dark underbelly of the current copyright regimes in the world. We certainly want authors to be adequately compensated for their work. We want filmmakers to be adequately compensated for their work. But some of the copyright regimes that we have in the world today tend to make material less accessible rather than more accessible. And individuals, whether they are in Nigeria, like Chioma Opara, or Mohammed at his university, will face a lot of challenges in trying to circumvent and navigate these copyright regimes, which do make materials less accessible in some instances. Just before I started teaching on January 4th, I went into a panic because a film I wanted to show in my class was available only on one platform, and a platform that is not widely used by my students. So I couldn't even say, okay, spend $4 and go and watch this film. So I workshopped a number of things with my friends. I thought, should I, do something that I would not normally do, show the film on my own laptop and then show it in Zoom. But that platform has actually, I won't mention the platform, they've actually configured their system that it will automatically pick up if you're trying to use Zoom or some other app to show their copyrighted material. And the person on the other end is just going to see a black screen. They're not going to see anything else. So I had reluctantly come to the conclusion that I would not be able to show the film anymore since I only have Zoom and it's not the platform that most of my students will be using. Then one day I was looking for something else on YouTube and discovered that somebody, I don't know who, had, I guess, decided to disregard the copyright regulation and had uploaded a free version of that film onto YouTube as a free film for anybody to watch. I will say that I immediately downloaded the free version on YouTube. I didn't, download anything from that particular app. And so I now have a way of asking my students to watch the film. But I very much empathize with what Chioma mentioned. It is a real challenge. It is a real challenge how to get books that are not accessible to students and how to get films that are no longer widely accessible because of copyright issues to students. There are one or two things I also wanted to add. I also wanted to add that one of the things I found that is in my classes, because I have encouraged a lot of discussion using the chat, and when students don't have to have their videos switched on, they themselves have been self-organizing and in the first few days of class and saying, can we organize a special discussion section for this class? Can we organize a Discord for this class? So they are self-organizing in terms of finding ways of communicating with each other and continuing the discussion once we get beyond the lecture. Finally, I have a question for Matt. Matt, you say you teach one of your lectures synchronously, and then for the next lecture that's scheduled, you assign the students some asynchronous activities. Could you give us some examples of the kind of asynchronous activities that you assign to your students? I appreciate that this may not necessarily be a literature class. I too teach a lot of classes that are not literature classes, but I think I'm just curious about the kinds of asynchronous activities that you're able to assign to your students on days when you are not meeting with them. Thank you.
Sure, I can, let everyone know about a couple of things that I'm working with, and I should, note here that I'm learning a lot from my colleagues, and getting ideas and even in some cases materials from them. Of course, I think this is really good that that nobody tries to do any of this on their own, that we must, make everything as collaborative as possible and learn from one another. This coming semester, I am teaching a course that is a kind of interdisciplinary introduction to African studies. So indeed, it's not primarily a literature course. And I'm really fortunate to be at a university that has a lot of, African studies faculty who work in different disciplines and study, a wide range of things. In normal circumstances, in this kind of course, we might call on those faculty to come and give guest lectures in our courses. But there have been some initiatives on my campus to record some of these guest lectures. But I think whether or not you have something like a video of someone else speaking, or you create a video of yourself speaking, I think, like Louisa mentioned, a very short kind of, sort of lecture video, 20 minutes, perhaps created by the primary instructor, perhaps calling on folks around you. Again, we have to be careful because everybody's stretched so thin. You don't want to ask too much of other people, but if someone can provide something. And then the way I've, again, learned from others, and I'm structuring that kind of activity is, let's say under normal circumstances, my class would meet for 2 lectures, on Wednesday and Friday. I'm having a synchronous live lecture session on Wednesday, a place to ask questions, introduce a new topic, a new idea, and have some discussion about it. But then sort of to make up for the other session that we're not holding live, I have maybe a short video piece, some reading to go along with it. And then what I'm learning is a great way to kind of get students to sort of wrap their heads around the material is to give them something that's kind of brand new and fresh to them. This could be like a part of a literary text, it could be an image, it could be artwork, different kinds of things, just to give students something, a data set of some kind, and just kind of cold, ask them, say, this is information related to Africa or African literature. What do you make of it? This would be like a non-graded exercise. Students kind of write responses. They kind of just off the cuff try to grapple with what they're looking at. And then through the, a second step in that sort of asynchronous activity is to show them a video of an expert talking about this particular piece of information, this particular literary text, or this particular artifact, and then readings and, sort of other ways for them to engage. I'm also, sort of reluctantly in some sense using quizzes in this online world just to kind of help ensure that students, again, are sort of having the kind of structure to make sure that they keep up with things, where I'm calling it a content check, so just to kind of check in, did they, actually watch that video and, glean a few important pieces of information from it? Did they actually engage those readings and glean a few important pieces of information from them? And so this is all, stuff that is there. It's like Moradewun, we're using Canvas at my university. But, if there's any kind of platform where you could just assemble a few resources and really give students this opportunity to kind of dig into things on their own, work through it, check whether or not they have understood things, that provides this flexible moment, this part of the week where they can do some of it at night and some of it in the morning and some just depending on when they can find time for it over the weekend, whatever works. And then once we come back around again to the next week, we can check in live. We can have, this kind of synchronous interaction and make sure that we're on the same page about things. And then once again, send them off into this kind of, semi-structured environment where they can, once again, grapple with things on their own. Another piece that could be added to that puzzle is some kind of online discussion with other students, where you prompt them to talk about the things that they're looking at and grappling with. And, and then they engage with each other. I find those online discussions, the kind of text-based online discussions are a mixed bag. Sometimes they're really fruitful, especially if you as an instructor can check in and, sort of guide the discussion in ways if possible. But sometimes students are just, they just check in, they say, oh, thanks, I loved your comment, so-and-so. And they don't really engage very substantively, and there are ways to try and nurture that. There are ways to try and kind of force them to engage more substantively. But I think we have to accept at the end of the day that there are limitations to these things, and that we can't just expect them to be good students. We have to provide sort of incentives and check-ins to keep them doing good work. And I in some ways, the final thing I want to say is, even with my own kids who are doing online school, my own students, my own teaching and so on, I've been saying to a lot of students and teachers and parents and whatnot lately that I think it's okay to say our expectations are different, not exactly lower. And I don't want to say that means we don't think we're going to get anything out of this experience. We're getting so much out of it that we don't even realize. But it's just different than what we are used to getting out of, educational experiences. So if I just don't think that students are going to have a really fruitful online text-based discussion, then I just don't use that tool. I change what my expectations are, and I just think about, what is it that they can do on their own, and how can we get through this semester together? And, how can one of the big things that we learn from all of it is just that we can collaborate, we can meet each other halfway, we can empathize with one another. I mean, I think we're learning a lot of new ways of understanding those issues, along with the content that we teach and learn. And I feel like, that is a really important part of the puzzle in and of itself.
Thank you, Matt. We have a question from our audience. One of the participants is wondering if it's possible to ask authors who understand the difficulty of access to their books in African universities to consider donating copies for departmental libraries. I don't know if there's a panelist who would like to take that question.
Yeah, if I may, I would like to say something in response to that question. Thank you very much for that question. I think one can, if you're able to get the address of an author, you might be able to communicate directly with an author and ask if they are willing to do that. There's also questions of shipping, the physical print book to particular locations. I would prefer actually going forward a kind of digital solution that is ebook versions of particular books, and have publishers themselves, not the authors necessarily, but publishers agree that when they are dealing with orders from universities in different locations of the world, that they will come up with either a pricing structure that takes into consideration the capacities of universities in different parts of the world, or they might even allow for certain materials to be made relatively free for limited amounts of time. They can put all kinds of strictures. You have to be enrolled in the university. You can only access it from the university site. If there's any evidence that it's been downloaded and printed, the individual who has done that will be found to have violated the conditions and can be held liable for doing that, because there's certain ebooks that are available in my library, and you are not allowed. You can maybe download a PDF of like 2 or 3 chapters, but the rest you cannot download. You're not allowed to download. You can read them online, but you cannot download them. So I think publishers have all kinds of, they have a big toolbox, but thus far they have not been using it. And I think instructors and also authors, we need to start putting pressure on publishers to be much more flexible with material that should be available to readers in different parts of the world. I mean, I'll just say one thing very quickly, which is kind of tangentially related to this topic. There's an article that I wrote for a journal 22 years ago, and somebody in another country in the world wanted to translate it and make it available to readers in her country, in Brazil. And this is an article, you're not paid for writing an article. The publisher that has since acquired the journal in which that article was published asked this this translator to pay, I don't know, $1,000 or $2,000 just to have access to translate an article. And I was so outraged. I wrote to the publisher, to the publishing company, and I complained. And I said, this is just outrageous. The publisher backed down. They brought their fee down, but it was still too much to pay. And so the article will not be translated. So I think we need to increase pressure on publishers from all sides to become much more reasonable so that material can be accessible to readers around the world.
Thank you, Moradewun. Louisa has a comment that she would like to add to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to build on the conversation around publishers, I'm also on the Council of the African Studies Association UK, and part of the conversation there has been exactly about this, more so in terms of academics when we're producing our monographs or producing our books, to try and build in conversations with publishers about the Africa rights, so the rights to the Africa editions, as for some publishers, this isn't at the foremost of their thinking. And so thinking through at that negotiation stage, who has the rights to that material? Because if it's able to be published in Africa by African publishers, that also will have an impact on its pricing and availability on the continent. And I know that there are issues around circulation, but thinking as we're moving into this increasingly digital era, as was said, the ebook option is increasingly, a viable and probably preferable option in terms of circulation and accessibility. So that might be something that we can all think about as we produce work.
Thank you. I believe Mohammed has some questions or comments to add.
Yes, I do. To start with, I agree with both Louisa and Moradewun. And of course, everything should be done to avoid placing that burden on authors in terms of donating their work. And Stephane made his point earlier on in his presentation that we should do everything to make sure African writers actually get real benefits from their writing, and asking them to donate their books will be one way to diminish those benefits, except those who are willing personally to do so. So finding ways, especially using publishers who actually carry the handle of so much and have access to so much, a better place to do so. And organizations like the ASA and the ALA could find, I know that those conversations have been had, for example, the African Literature Association, but they can be ongoing in order to find ways to allow, those of us who are abroad and who have access to resources in ways that our colleagues on the ground and our students in Africa don't have. So this is something that we'll keep doing. The point I wanted to make actually has to do with creativity, with inventiveness in the time of COVID. In starting her presentation, Louisa referred to Achebe's comments about Okonkwo losing, I believe, the planting seeds because of too much sun, the rain coming too late, the seeds dry up or rotted. So this is a moment of madness, as it was in the case of Okonkwo. And in moments of madness and disaster, we also have opportunities to rethink the way we do things. And pretty much all of my colleagues have touched on that point in one way or the other. And one of the things that COVID allowed me to do was to experiment with the teaching of literature. And in this past fall, I taught a course which is an advanced intermediate course in French. And as I do in all of my courses, regardless of the level, I try to bring literature into them. And one of the things I always wanted to do was to allow students to read poetry, to engage in the learning of poetry, even at the basic level of language learning, and stick with that throughout the semester. So one of the things I did in my class, I used what I call a tri-breed system. That is, on Mondays, we met virtually. On Wednesdays, we met in person whenever it was possible, allowing for physical distancing. And on Fridays, usually I didn't meet with the students at all. I divided the students into pairs in the class and assigned each pair a poem, including a lot of poems from Africa. And the student's responsibility was to stay with this poem from the start to the end of the semester. And I will give them specific assignments on the poem. So every week they will have to do something specific on the author, on the poem, et cetera, and report back via Zoom or via Canvas to me and to their classmates, and I will meet with them separately. So this is just a way of saying that there are ways we can use disasters like the COVID pandemic to experiment in ways that we may not be able to do under so-called normal circumstances. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for these very thoughtful observations about teaching in the age of pandemic. This is an unusually hard time, a lot of balancing acts, a lot of negotiations in the way we have to do things. And I really appreciate the points that you all have made, especially the urgent need for digital texts in our fields. E-texts on African literary criticism, more open educational resources. These are all very important, especially when we think about the situation of our international, the situation that our international panelists have noted here. The digital gap, how do we overcome these? How do we make the best of a very bad situation? And so these are things we should be thinking about in as we walk towards achieving the best in our teaching, let us, think about ways that we can, exhibit that empathy that we have talked about earlier on, so that students will also feel, feel their humanity despite all that they have gone through or are still going through. So at this point, I would like to wrap this up and thank you for these enlightening discussions on the challenges of teaching online in our field. On behalf of the Teaching and Research Committee, the ALA Executive Council, I render my sincere appreciation to our panelists for the insights and the perspectives that they have shared with us today. Many thanks also to our participants across the globe who have made time to join us and share their questions and their comments. We also appreciate all ALA EC members, the ALA President, Professor Ogema Negash of the College of Arts and Sciences, Ohio University, for supporting this engagement in the interest of ALA membership. So, whether we are teaching online, synchronously, asynchronously, or using a combination of hybrid formats, we all know that teaching today requires much creativity. We hope you have got some valuable tips and ideas to incorporate into your spring classes, while we look forward with fortitude to the end of this rampaging pestilence. Now, on this note, I wish you all a very fruitful 2021. Please be safe and have a successful spring semester. Thank you all. Be safe.